I was invited here today to talk about nautical archaeology and what it has to do with College Station, a city that is hours from the nearest large body of water. Texas A&M University has been a prominent name in nautical archaeology since the 1970s, but most Brazos Valley residents would be surprised at how many shipwrecks have passed through here over the years. Nautical archaeology is the term that I'll be using for this presentation, in large part because I'll be talking a little bit about the nautical archaeology program. But there are other terms with their own nuances, some broader, some more specific about the topics that they cover. But when I say nautical archaeology, generally I'll be referring to the recovery of information from submerged artifacts and underwater sites for the interpretation of past human cultures. These sites may be a single event, such as shipwrecks or plane crashes. They could be settlements, such as the portion of the city of Port Royal, Jamaica, that sank following an earthquake. And a site could be represented by just a few artifacts, such as a buried dugout canoe. Nautical archaeologists take techniques used for land-based archaeology and apply them to submerged sites. For example, excavating in a grid pattern, taking photos and drawing site plans, assigning artifacts coordinates so we know exactly where they came from on site, as well as screening the dirt that removed in each grid unit, and so on. Nowadays, in the right conditions, some underwater sites are photographed at the end of every workday in a field season to produce 3D models of the site. There are definitely techniques and situations that do not transfer. For example, no underwater site will ever be able to achieve the perfectly straight unit walls that terrestrial archaeologists strive to achieve. And many of my colleagues regularly excavate in areas where their visibility is a foot or less, depending fully on months or years of training and just feeling around by touch, and depending on technology to guide them around the sites. And sometimes we return to our sites only to find that an octopus has made off with the ceramic we had just recorded the previous day. But then land sites also have their own critters to contend with, so we are a little bit more alike than we think sometimes. Nautical archaeology is not new, though before the 1940s, most projects could best be described as salvage operations and faced the limits of free diving and early diving equipment. For example, 2 first-century ships in Italy's Lake Nemi were subject to multiple salvage attempts in the 15th, 16th, and 18th centuries, before the lake was drained in the final attempt in the early 20th century. Helmet diving, developed in the 1820s, allowed for some investigation of underwater sites, including the investigation of a submerged settlement in Lake Zurich. Early 19th century helmet divers made some attempts to salvage artifacts from the 18th century British ship of the line Royal George, before the ship was removed from the shipping lane with explosives. Mary Rose, Henry VIII's battleship, was dived on by helmet divers in the mid-19th century. Some artifacts were retrieved at the time, but the ship was not fully salvaged until the 1980s. And when I say fully salvaged, the entire part of the ship that remained was brought up. In most cases, early investigations of underwater sites relied on quickly bringing objects to the surface, with little to no attempt to map the site or the location of the artifacts. Whether those things retrieved were 1 or 2 small artifacts or an entire ship, there were often no long-term plans for the care of what was salvaged. I have heard more than one story of a ship or collection of artifacts that was excavated, shown off for a brief period of time, only to be stored and forgotten in a barn for decades. However, in 1943, the invention of the aqualung, the first modern scuba equipment, opened the door for archaeological investigations to be conducted underwater. No longer dependent on expensive, cumbersome equipment that relied on hoses leading to the surface, divers and diving archaeologists were able to dive deeper for longer periods of time, much more safely than before. And so let's bring this back to College Station. George Bass is known as the father of nautical archaeology and the founder of the Nautical Archaeology program at Texas A&M. In 1960, he was invited by a fellow archaeologist to be a co-director for the first expedition to entirely excavate an ancient shipwreck underwater, a late Bronze Age ship near Cape Galedonia, Turkey. And this was the first of many shipwreck excavations he would be part of through his life. He received a PhD in classical archaeology from the University of Pennsylvania in 1964 and continued to teach there for several years. In 1972, he founded the Institute of Nautical Archaeology, or INA, which is committed to locating, excavating, recording, preserving, and publishing shipwrecks and other archaeological sites of maritime significance all over the world. A couple years later, the institution was looking for a new headquarters where it could grow and prosper. As it was told to us graduate students, East Carolina University seemed like a good fit. But when Dr. Bass made the pitch, the university was interested, but the offer was lackluster. One of Dr. Bass's friends had a connection at Texas A&M University, was able to get him a meeting, and while not perhaps the ideal location, if they made an offer, it could be used as leverage in negotiations with East Carolina. And A&M did make an offer, one that was so generous that East Carolina either could not or would not match it. And so in 1976, the Institute of Nautical Archaeology's headquarters moved to College Station, and the Nautical Archaeology program was founded, the first academic program in the United States to offer a graduate degree in the archaeology of ships and history of seafaring. While the two are separate entities, INA and the Nautical Archaeology program still share the ground floor of the anthropology building on campus and have a mutually beneficial relationship. Students benefit from connecting with experts in the field and can gain work and field experience. INA benefits from having a pool of well-trained, dive-certified archaeologists to further their mission. Graduates of the Nautical Archaeology program fill positions at state and federal organizations, cultural resource management firms, museums, universities, and other public and private organizations all over the world, continuously shaping the field of nautical archaeology. Today, the nautical program has several laboratories covering various aspects of research and practical applications. In the Old World, New World, and ship reconstruction laboratories, students learn the history of shipbuilding from the earliest depictions, how to draw the lines of a hull in the rigging, and with just a section of hull, they can hypothesize on the shape and size of a ship. They help analyze and write reports on fieldwork and analyze artifacts, and learn about modern methods of survey and excavation. In the ship model laboratory, students can learn how to physically construct model ships from a professional ship modeler using archives, artifacts, and practical know-how to produce accurate models. The newest addition, the Analytical Archaeology Laboratory, was developed with the goal of expanding our knowledge of archaeology through technology. This includes laser scanning, materials analysis, microscopy, photogrammetry, and 3D printing. And I'll be honest, it's very difficult to express how interesting these labs are with just a few sentences and just a couple photos. You really need to see them in person. And although it is months early to advertise this event, the Nautical Archaeology program hosts an event every year in April called Shipwreck Weekend. This is a one-day open house with presentations on current research and activities for all ages in all of our labs, as well as outside the building for wetter or dirtier activities. This day starts with a lecture, usually by an outside expert. Past speakers have covered topics like Queen Anne's Revenge, Franklin's lost expedition to the north, digital ship reconstruction, and Roman naval warfare, just to name a few. If you have an interest in history, and especially anything related to ships, it is a great way to spend a day with family. And lastly, what brought me to the Nautical Archaeology program, and the focus of the remainder of this talk, is the Conservation Research Laboratory, one of the oldest continuously operated conservation laboratories that deals primarily with archaeological material from shipwrecks and other underwater sites. CRL was founded in 1978 by Dr. Donnie Hamilton, one of the original faculty members of the Nautical Archaeology program. When he retired in 2020, Dr. Chris Dostal became our new director. Although CRL had humble beginnings, we've definitely grown over the years, from a single building to an entire block on Rellis campus. And although we primarily refer to our Rellis location as CRL, the lab also includes a small conservation lab on main campus that serves as a classroom to teach students the principles of archaeological conservation. Since it was founded, CRL has taken on nearly 300 projects. These projects range in size from 1 or 2 small objects to entire shipwrecks, from terrestrial and waterlogged sites from all over the world. And our clients include both individuals and organizations. And while all this is impressive, that does lead to the question of why do we need all that space? What is conservation and why is it important? Simply put, conservation is the step between excavation and exhibition. It is a conservator's job to use special techniques to stabilize artifacts and stop further degradation so the artifacts can be retained in perpetuity in its current condition. Our goal is not to repair and replace parts until the artifact is like new. We consider that the broken and worn condition of an artifact is part of the story that it can tell us. These are 2 examples of artifacts from a marine environment that were not treated. The object to the left is a cannonball, a solid ball of cast iron. As it dried, the salt crystals also dried and expanded, causing cracks to appear and eventually expand into fissures. To the right, we have a piece of wood that was originally a thick timber, and an extended period of time underwater caused the starches and sugars that provide structure to the cells to dissolve and be replaced with water. As that water evaporates into the air, there is nothing left to hold the cells up, leading them to collapse. And while the cells are obviously a very small scale, we can see it in the large scale. We can see that this timber has shrunken, part of it close to the original size only due to the proximity of an iron fastener and its corrosion products that have bled into the wood. And the surface has become cracked and checked. For both of these objects, the damage done due to uncontrolled drying is irreversible. While any artifact from an archaeological site is going to need some level of conservation, artifacts from waterlogged sites, especially saltwater sites, face a set of unique challenges. The most visible is the development of a thick layer of what we call concretion or incrustation. As iron degrades in water, its corrosion products combine with minerals in the water to form a thick layer that covers the artifact and anything nearby. Concretion that covers a cannon may also cover its wood gun carriage. Concretion could cover an entire glass bottle, and we wouldn't know it. Concretion obscures the object. For example, a broken musket barrel and a drift bolt look very similar when covered in lumpy concretion, and it also obscures the condition that the material is in. Concretion can also preserve a lot of information. For example, on some sites, the only organic materials that survive were only able to survive because the concretion protected them from marine pests, such as teredo worms, and erosion. And sometimes, when the iron continues to degrade, the concretion is all that remains to preserve the shape of what was once there. So often, before we can even begin to evaluate the artifacts that come into our lab, we must X-ray them to find out what exactly we have, then carefully go about removing the concretion before beginning conservation treatments. The challenges we face in archaeological conservation can barely be covered in a semester of classes, so I'm not going to try to fit them all into this talk today. Suffice it to say, it cannot be denied that if there is an excavation with waterlogged materials, they will need intervention by a conservator if you want them to survive for long. These days, it is incredibly uncommon for any site to be excavated without a conservation plan and funding. When I first sat down to develop this talk, I knew I wanted to focus on 1 or 2 projects to use as examples. We certainly don't have a shortage. In 2021, we finished conservation of 20,000 artifacts from a Civil War ironclad vessel named CSS Georgia from the mouth of the Savannah River. We recently received a shipment of 17 Revolutionary War era cannons from the same river. And we're currently conserving timbers of a ship used as landfill from Alexandria, Virginia, and 2 dugout canoes from Louisiana. But I wanted to focus on Texas. Again, there is no shortage of choices. We have a recurring contract with the Texas Historical Commission to conserve artifacts from their terrestrial sites, and just a couple years ago, we conserved a collection of cannon from the Alamo. But this talk is about nautical archaeology. And while there are no historic shipwrecks that I know of in the Brazos Valley, there are 2 Texas wrecks that spent quite a lot of time here and which make for excellent day trips. I'll give you a small taste today, but I highly encourage you to visit La Belle in Austin and USS Westfield in Texas City if you do get the chance. La Belle was a 17th century French ship of exploration, one of 4 ships that set out to set up a colony at the mouth of the Mississippi River with the intention of promoting Christianity and developing a convenient location from which to attack and gain control of Spanish silver mines. An explorer, René Robert Cavelier Sieur de La Salle, led the expedition. Unfortunately, as you can imagine, the journey did not go as planned. La Belle, intended for coastal and river travel, was supposed to be packed into one of the 3 larger ships and finished in the New World. But overpacking meant that La Belle was constructed in France to hold the extra cargo and passengers. Although all 4 ships did manage to cross the Atlantic intact, one of the ships was taken by pirates in the Caribbean. After that, difficulty calculating latitude at the time meant that while the expedition was intended to find the mouth of the Mississippi River, they ended up 400 miles west in Matagorda Bay, Texas. Just a slight miscalculation. And while La Belle was easily able to navigate into the bay, as you can see in this lovely painting here, La Mabe, one of the other ships, was grounded on a sandbar and could not be recovered. Only the cargo was able to be recovered. Then, irreconcilable differences between La Salle and the captain of La Jolie, a temporary escort ship, led La Jolie to leave upon arrival in the New World. The colonists made the best of a bad situation, and under La Salle's orders, they built a settlement, Fort St. Louis, while La Salle led expeditions to find the Mississippi. However, La Salle, by all accounts a horrible leader, recorded in the journal of the expedition's journalist, he was eventually killed by other members of one of these expeditions near modern-day Navasota. So think about that when you pass through the roundabout with La Salle's statue in Navasota. He was killed somewhere near there. And there's our connection to the Brazos Valley. This expedition did eventually find the Mississippi and follow it up to Canada, on foot for the most part. But by the time French ships returned to the area, both the fort and La Belle were gone. La Belle sunk in a storm soon after La Salle left on his final expedition in January 1686. Research and surveys to find the location of the wreck began in the 1970s. In 1995, the Texas Antiquities Committee, now the Texas Historical Commission, performed a magnetometer survey and located a few targets they thought could be the wreckage of La Belle. Divers investigated these likely targets, and in a coincidence that never happens in archaeology, on the first dive of the first day, they did find wreckage of what seemed to be a ship. And on the second dive of the first day, one of the divers laid hands on one of the, they're called dolphins, the lifting handles of a bronze cannon. They're very distinct. These cannons had many markings on them, but what led archaeologists to believe that this was La Belle was the fact that the cannons had the crest of Le Comte de Vermandois, a title given to an illegitimate son of Louis XIV, who served as admiral of the French fleet from the age of 2 until his death at age 16 in 1683, when preparations for the expedition were underway. The cannons could only have been cast during this 14-year span. And serial numbers on the guns were later confirmed in French archives as being part of La Belle's armament. As the ship was in only 20 feet of water, rather than dive on the site for multiple field seasons and blackwater conditions, a cofferdam was constructed to make the underwater site a land site. Excavation took place over several months in 1996 and 1997. Over 1.6 million artifacts were recovered and conserved. Cannon, muskets, lead shot, axes, knives, cooking and serving ware, glass beads, and brass bells and rings for trade. Truly a kit for a colony. All the supplies a group of colonists would need to establish themselves and trade with Native Americans in order to survive their first years in the New World. The array and level of preservation of the artifacts is truly impressive. In addition to several books on the history and excavation on the ship, there was a 900-page book focusing on various categories of the artifacts published in 2019 that I highly recommend purchasing if you are interested in this period of time. And then, of course, there was the hull itself. La Belle had sunk into a fine mud, which protected the bottom third of the hull, including much of the keel in the mud from weather and marine pests. Once all the cargo was removed and sent to CRL, the hull followed. Archaeologists carefully documented and labeled each timber and plank before removing it and sending them to CRL. There was a really fascinating discovery during this process. La Belle was intended to be constructed in the New World, where the timbers packed in one of the other ships. But how was this to be done properly without a master shipbuilder? And apparently the answer is by labeling the parts like a piece of IKEA furniture. Along the keel are several Roman numerals that match up with corresponding labeled timbers. And this is very exciting to us because this is the kind of day-to-day things that never make it into official archives. Perhaps there was a piece of paper transferred from the shipbuilders in France to the colonists. Perhaps something was just torn up and the paper reused later. But that's not something we get to read about every day. And this ended up not only being helpful to the builders, or would have been helpful to the colonists, but it was also helpful to us conservators. The ship was reassembled in a purpose-built vat at CRL onto frames to support its weight and prevent the shape from being lost during the years that it would spend in treatment. As I said previously, we can't just let wood dry out, or it will become irreversibly damaged. We have to replace the water with another substance to help provide structure, and this process takes a long time. Often, this can take 10 to 20 years for something the size of a ship. For La Belle, we used a chemical called polyethylene glycol, or PEG. It's something that you all have used in your lifetime. It used to be added to sodas to make them taste smooth, although I believe that stopped in the late 1980s. And it's a common ingredient in a lot of lotions today. Depending on the molecular weight of PEG used, it can be as dense as water or as dense as candle wax and needs to be melted before being added into a solution. The amount of PEG was in the solution was slowly increased over the years. Then the ship was disassembled once again and loaded into our freeze dryer. This is the largest freeze dryer at an educational facility in the US, sized to allow us to freeze dry the keel of La Belle without cutting it. Until recently, we did recently find out that ours used to be the biggest in the world, but Australia has us beat by a meter or two right now. So, recently heard about that, but we're still the biggest in this hemisphere. The combination of PEG and the sublimation process of the freeze dryer, this is the process where water transitions directly from a solid to a gas, skipping the liquid form in between, produced a wood hull that had undergone minimal changes in dimensions, has a pleasing natural wood color, and timbers that were relatively light. Maintaining its dimensions and keeping the weight manageable meant that it was a much more manageable job for conservators and volunteers to reconstruct the whole of LaBelle in the Bullock Texas State History Museum in Austin under view of in-person and online visitors. And the ship and a selection of artifacts can still be viewed at the museum to this day. Fast forwarding to the Civil War, we arrive at the second shipwreck of today, USS Westfield. Westfield was a sidewheel steamer powered by a low-pressure walking beam engine and was built in 1861 as a Staten Island ferry. There are no photographs or plans of Westfield, but it is assumed that it was built almost identically to other Simonson-built Staten Island ferries. Double-ended and homogeneous in appearance, each having 2 decks, a gangway extending from stem to stern, and a superstructure concealing the paddle wheel that was flush with gunwale. 5 months later, Westfield was one of 24 ferries purchased by the U.S. Navy to be converted into ironclad vessels. The ferries had an advantageous design. The shallow-drafted, double-ended ships had decks designed for heavy burdens, which meant that they could navigate in shallow waters, easily move up and down rivers, and be outfitted to carry heavy artillery. Captained by Commander William B. Renshaw, Westfield was first assigned to Commander Porter's mortar flotilla at the mouth of the Mississippi River. In 1862, Westfield became the flagship for the West Gulf Blockading Squadron, stationed along the Texas coast, their focus on Galveston Island. The island was captured by the squadron in October of 1862. However, on New Year's Day of 1863, Confederate General Magruder launched a combined land and sea attack on Union troops at Galveston. During the battle, Westfield ran aground on Pelican Spit on an outgoing tide and could not be dislodged. With the tides of battle turning against the Union, Renshaw made the decision to evacuate the crew and set the ship to detonate. When the expected explosion did not occur, Renshaw and some of his men returned, only to be caught up in a delayed blast. The remaining Union ships fled, and Galveston remained under Confederate control for the rest of the war. The general location of the wreck was known for some time, but it was only excavated in 2009 due to a U.S. Army Corps of Engineers project to expand the Houston shipping channel. As in Matagorda Bay, visibility in the area is abysmal, and shipping traffic makes conditions unsafe for divers. Therefore, excavation was carried out using barge cranes with different attachments, recovering artifacts in a grid system. Approximately 5,000 artifacts were recovered for conservation. Due to the construction method of the ship and the materials on the ship, environmental conditions, and the excavation method, most of the artifacts were iron, rusting and covered in concretion. Work started by taking x-rays, in some cases revealing surprising artifacts, like this condiment shaker cap next to the shaft of a bolt. Then conservators used pen-sized pneumatic chisels called air scribes to slowly remove the layers of concretion and expose the metal beneath. The most important step in conserving iron from a marine environment is to reduce or remove the chlorides that drive the corrosion process. At CRL, we do this using a process called electrolytic reduction. If anyone here has done any electroplating, this is the exact opposite process. The artifact is connected to the negative charge of a DC power supply, and the steel tank or steel mesh that we place around it is connected to the positive charge. The negatively charged salt ions in the artifact are attracted to the positive charge, removing the chlorides and reducing corrosion products back to metal. The tanks are monitored weekly so that we know when to change out the solutions and when the artifacts are done. Once the chlorides are at an acceptable level, the artifact is boiled to remove chemical residue and sealed with tannic acid and microcrystalline wax or a weather-resistant paint. These photos are of a more recent project, several cannons from St. Augustine, Florida. When using paint, we've recently started doing the first layer of paint in a very eye-catching color, with 2 more coats of black paint on top. When our clients see bright pink or red, they know that the paint is chipping and that the artifact may be either in need of a touch-up of paint or possibly reconservation. This was the process that was applied to most of the Westfield collection, and slowly the shipping containers full of tetanus-carrying junk was transformed into crates of stable artifacts ready for study and curation. One of our graduate students at the time, Justin Parkoff, saw something in the collection, though. As conservators, it is our job to stabilize artifacts, and as the first people to have a closer look at the details, often we help to make sense of the collection, develop connections between the artifacts, and discern their purpose. But usually our intervention is limited to notes, perhaps taking broken artifacts that have dispersed to different sides of the site and gluing them back together. Justin went a huge step further. In a collection of misshapen, fragmentary metal, he saw the inner workings of Westfield. He searched archives for plans of similar ships and worked with researchers and fellow students. With this backbone of knowledge and help, he was able to take the artifacts from the site and develop a model of Westfield's boiler and other mechanical components. Many of the artifacts we had lined up perfectly with the schematics of Westfield's sister ships. Some were off by an inch or less. Adjustments were made in the digital model until everything lined up as perfectly as it could. Once the digital and scale models were done, he worked with A&M's Architecture Ranch and carpenters to create replicas of the ship's engine system, including a replica of the boiler, with 1/2 made of wood and 1/2 a wire frame with the original boiler parts attached. These impressive displays, along with displays for smaller artifacts, are on exhibit at the Texas City Museum. At any time in its history, CRL has only ever had 3 or 4 full-time staff. Much of our success is due to the graduate student employees and volunteers that are so passionate about learning and developing their skills and sharing knowledge of the things that they love with the world. The exhibits and publications for LaBelle and Westfield are wonderful testaments to what passions and years of hard work can achieve. Before ending my presentation, I did just want to share some ways that you can connect to us or learn more. While the lab is not open for people to wander, we do enjoy giving tours to educational groups, organizations, and if you are interested in having an in-person tour, our director, Dr. Chris Dostal's email is on this slide, and I also have my own business cards I can share. And of course, if you're interested in Shipwreck Weekend, they have a Facebook that is usually updated around March with information about what day it's supposed to be and what speaker that they have. And you can also see previous speakers. I believe they have some recordings of previous speakers on that Facebook page. And then you can find us online. Our main website is through the anthropology department's website. We also have a Facebook where I am currently posting daily for Texas Archaeology Month. Anyone that's interested in archaeology should check out Texas Archaeology Month. There are things going on throughout the state at various sites for whether that's presentations or activities for kids, things like that. And if you're interested in seeing or checking out any of the Institute of Nautical Archaeology's projects, they have hundreds at this point. Many of those are listed on their website, along with pictures of the site and artifacts. That's always a fun look through. with that, thank you very much, and I am happy to answer whatever questions you have.